Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the Green Infrastructure Network meeting. I welcome you, and I am excited to learn the things we're going to cover today. A few quick reminders. Please make sure to mute your microphones, and you're welcome to stay on camera. Often, as a presenter, Tom would appreciate talking to people as opposed to circles, but we're all getting used to it in this day and age. It can be tricky. But I also want to welcome you to use our chat. So just some logistics of the meeting. You're welcome to pop into the chat if you would like PDHs, which are continuing education certificates that just mark that you attended today's workshop. We'll get those to you. So drop that into the chat if you would like one. And then on top of that, we also did an icebreaker. If you want to scroll the chat or enter your own information. We'd love to see what your favorite spring flower may be. It may have not yet popped, and come out, but it may be right on the verge or the one you're looking forward to the most. So um, I look forward to continuing to see what everyone's favorite flowers are. So um, the cool thing about spring is spring really is the time for us to be emerging. And I think as a whole society, we're really doing that right now. It's been a tricky time and a tricky couple years. And so I really appreciate you making time for this meeting today. I think that there's a lot to be learned from other areas in the state. And I think a lot of times, Tom, I don't know if you know this, you get a lot of hate from the Ohio River Basin. We spend a lot of time being a little jelly, right? A little jealous of the Chesapeake Bay. And we spend a lot of time actually not necessarily digging in on what are the lessons learned over there and how can we, apply them to the headwaters of the Ohio, right? And so I want to know that everyone to know that I am equal opportunist, right? So I am happy to welcome the Chesapeake Bay and individuals from it today so that we can learn and grow from some of the things that they're doing. And just because they have a lot of the financing from the state means they can blaze the trails for what works and what doesn't. And we can make sure we can learn from those lessons here today. So just as a reminder, the Green Infrastructure Network is evolving and growing collaborative of over 80 volunteer organizations, universities, businesses, government partners who recognize the benefits of using green infrastructure and nature-based solutions in managing Allegheny County's stormwater problems. And I want to thank Alkazan for supporting and allowing Jin to be a part of the programs here at Three Rivers Wet Weather. So thank you, Alkazan. And so let's just get into it, right? So today we have a very special presentation for you. Please help welcoming Tom Schueler. Tom has 35 years of experience in practical aspects of stormwater and restoration practices to protect and restore urban watersheds. Tom directs the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, a nonprofit devoted to training and engaging the public and private sectors to build a more sustainable practices. Their mission is to help restore the Chesapeake Bay and the 1,000 miles of streams in our nation's watershed. Tom also serves as the watershed coordinator for the EPA Chesapeake Bay program and has guided a dozen expert panels to consensus on the best practices to reduce runoff, pollution, and pollutants from the urban sector. Some notable expert panels include stormwater retrofits, stormwater restoration, low impact development practices, urban nutrient management, street cleanings, and floating treatments for wetlands, right? So in his career, Tom has written more than 50 stormwater design manuals, research reports on best management practices, and other watershed guidance documents. Tom founded the Center for Watershed Protection in 1992 and loves stream walks, floodplain reconnection, and kingfishers when in season. So we'd like to welcome Tom as the speaker today. Tom, you will have to unmute, but we can't wait to learn and grow from you today. So kick us off. Tom, I think you're on mute. Your microphone is muted. Sadly, I'm not allowed to unmute you. I apologize. Uh, it should be, oh, because of the PowerPoint. If you want to end presentation, it might allow you to see your PowerPoint, and then I think you can find yeah, and then you can find Teams. Sorry about that. We'll get started here in a second. If anyone hasn't dropped their favorite flower in the chat, I'm not even sure how to pronounce Brian's nasturtiums. I don't even know what that is. I'll have to Google it later. So I'm kind of excited to find out more about some of these flowers. Sounds like I need to learn some on my own. So
Can you hear me now?
yes, absolutely. Sorry about that, Tom. That's my fault. So if you want to go back through the sharing process, and we can get
Sure.
started. So welcome officially. Thank you for speaking. And we're really excited. And none of us will have any biases today, and we'll be thoughtful and kind and learn from the Chesapeake Bay. And then the headwaters of the Ohio will take the lessons, and we'll get better at everything, I think. So
Great. It was very propitious that I was on mute because I'm at the bottom of the hill with a train that just came by, so that would have caused some problems. Let me see. Let me get my slides up and. Ah, damn it. Yeah, again, it's a real pleasure to talk with you all today, even by remote. Hopefully, in the next few months, we can emerge from our caves and meet in person and enjoy our stormwater colleagues. But I put some remarks together about some
hey,
of the
Tom,
efforts.
we're actually not seeing the PowerPoint. I'm so sorry. I think I'm seeing a big white screen. I don't know if it just hasn't loaded yet or not.
Can you see it now?
Sadly, no. I'm happy to, if has the PowerPoint changed since the one you sent me? I'm happy to be in charge of it if you want me to.
Yeah, why don't you do that, please?
Okay. All right, let me do that. It'll just take a second to pull up. So maybe tell us a little bit more about yourself while I find it.
Sure. I've been working in the Bay watershed for many years now, but we try to work very closely with local governments to confront the many challenges uh, in terms of maintaining water quality. But over those years, we've kind of dismissed, or we haven't focused as much on the quantity of runoff. And so some of those issues I'd like to talk with you about today. We're based in Ellicott City, Maryland, which is an old mill town, um, very old, about 1775 when the first mills came in, and we're very prone to flooding. Um, in fact, thank you. Next slide, please. Um, this is Ellicott City in 2016. We had about 6 inches of rainfall in just under 90 minutes, created enormous urban flash flood through the historic town. It was so great that 200 cars were washed into the river. And on the bottom left-hand side, you can see the street. My office is just on the third floor in that photo. So it really wiped us out for about 6 months. And then 2 years later, we got another 500-year storm that knocked us out again. So in terms of the rainfall distribution, that's on the next slide. Yeah, this is just the first flood I mentioned. Um, it was just an incredible storm event, what the meteorologists call a streaming event, where or a training event, where it just keeps on coming over the same areas. So you can see 6 inches in 2 hours, and it just overwhelmed the capacity of uh, the stream network, storm drains, and so the street ended up being um, the flooding release. So that's why I think it's really important. It really does affect communities a great deal. Uh, our local economy in this town is still hasn't quite recovered completely, although there has been a big effort to rebuild. So I think these are the kind of issues that will face communities throughout the Northeast, particularly due to climate change. But before I get into my main talk, I just wanted to talk about what's new at the Chesapeake Stormwater Network in the post-pandemic days. Um, if I could have the next slide, please. Yeah, we do a lot of technical work. We've been working on a unified guide for our stream restoration protocols, which have prompted almost 1,000 miles of stream restoration in the Bay watershed, including Pennsylvania, with some pretty neat techniques. We're also launching this summer uh, what we call the Chesapeake Urban Stormwater Professional Training Program, which is a series of 11 or 12 webcasts to train young professionals on, particularly people of color, on the nuts and bolts of being successful in our field. As you can tell from this talk, we're doing a lot of work on extreme rainfall and watershed warming and how that affects stormwater BMP resiliency. As was mentioned in the outset, part of our role is we get the scientists and practitioners and bureaucrats together to run these expert panels to come to consensus on what the rules should be. And then we also have one of the most fun things we do at CSN is we have the Best Urban BMP in the Bay Awards, or BUBBAs. And there's 7 different categories, everything from Best Residential BMP to Best Stream Restoration Project to Best Outreach Program. And they're very, we get somewhere between 70 and 100 nominations every time we do it. So we're having our 6th contest in 2023. And if you want anything more about the Chesapeake Stormwater Network, our website is shown at the bottom, www.chesapeakestormwater.net. So the next slide is just a list of the next slide shows the list of expert panels that we've developed over the last decade or so to provide guidance to the MS4s. What's kind of different about the Bay watershed is a lot of the numeric pollutant reduction targets are attached to the MS4 permits at both phase 1 and phase 2 MS4s. And so it really prompts significant implementation at the local level. And there's a wide range of different practices that can provide sediment or nutrient credit. The ones on the right-hand side are a little bit more boutique in the sense that they're applied by just a few communities, whereas the ones on the left-hand side are probably the major strategies that most MS4s use to get their bay-wide pollutant reductions. The next slide, it goes over the key themes I'd like to cover today. And that's, the first is a technical question, is how much will extreme storms and their corresponding design events increase in our region due to future climate change. Secondly, kind of touch on how we're currently managing our flooding risk in our communities, and I'll make the case that we're not doing everything that people think we are. The third theme is, what are the ways we can identify what's most vulnerable to damage in our community? What are those municipal assets that need to be protected, and neighborhoods that most susceptible to flooding damage? And then lastly, touch on some tools that we can use to, as a community, to improve our resilience to future climate change. And having said that, everyone's still trying to figure this out. It's not a established science. Even the practice, we're still working out a lot of the details. But the next slide kind of shows what the picture is for us in the Chesapeake Bay, but also, I believe, in the Northeast, based on my understanding of the climate data. We suffer really two main impacts. One is an increase in extreme rainfall intensity, which prompts more urban flooding risks, particularly in the upper portions of our watersheds. And then the second impact, which has already been measured in the waters of the streams and rivers going to the Chesapeake Bay, is warming. Several degrees of increase have already occurred, which is harming our cool and cold water fisheries as well. So in the next slide, ignore the left-hand side and focus on the right-hand side. This is some data, I believe it is from NOAA, but it just kind of shows a map of the country about who's going to get hit with the most extreme precipitation. And you can see that the Southeast is about 30%, the Midwest about 40%, but lo and behold, for us in the Bay watershed, and I believe for you as well, you're pretty much in the epicenter of, to be able to expect a great deal more extreme rainfall events than you had historically bargained on. And it kind of makes a lot of our engineering assumptions about design storms, it kind of throws many of them out the window. The next slide shows three Chesapeake Bay communities: Virginia Beach, which is in the Tidewater area; Annapolis, Maryland, which is in the center of Maryland; and Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. And the 2-year storm and 10-year storm, the 100-year storm increases are shown in the table. And this was actually derived from a very detailed statistical study by Cornell University and the RAND Corporation and ourselves in the Chesapeake Bay. There's a wonderful tool that you can get these predictions for just about anywhere in the watershed. And in this case, this is the increase to the year 2050. And essentially, no matter where you are in the watershed, it's looking at a 10 to 20% increase in the design storm intensity, which, like, for a 100-year storm, that means you're getting, going from like 9 inches to 11 inches or 12 inches. And so the question is, what will that overwhelm our infrastructure? The next slide basically just makes the case that as we get more extreme rainfall, it increases the load on our urban stormwater infrastructure and creates a lot of different risks to manage in our community. In the next slide, it's a really ancient slide from very early in my career, but I think it's always good to go over the flow path issues. On the top panel, you can see the flow path for prior to development. And generally speaking, you have a series, you start at the top of the ridge, the flow goes as sheet flow, and then after maybe 150 feet, it forms rills and gullies, and then goes into a zero order stream, and then into a perennial stream. And that's what the watershed is used to. In the post-development scenario, you get a rapid concentration of flow, usually in the first 75 feet or less, and then it goes into a swale, and then the swales become harder, and sometimes concrete, and then we usually dump them in a storm drain pipe. So we're accelerating the speed at which runoff reaches the receiving water. Next slide.
Hey, Tom, we actually have a question in the chat. Do you know any municipalities that have incorporated those rainfall projections into their design standards or stormwater ordinances? I can go back to, I think they're talking about these numbers on this slide. So that's a question for you.
Yeah, that's a great question. And the answer is some are beginning to at the municipal level in terms of their engineering requirements for storm drain design and such. Our tidewater communities are probably leading the way, but these numbers just came out last August. And to be honest, the issue is who calls the shots. The local governments want the state to tell them they've got to change them because, as you can fully expect, more rainfall increases the design and engineering costs for future development. So the locals and the states are both trying to figure out how they're going to respond and incorporate these. Traditionally, when it comes to stormwater, the decisions about design storms are usually reserved by the state stormwater agencies. But at the local level, a lot of the engineering for things like streets and storm drains are set by local governments. So a long-winded answer, but we're still struggling with the numbers, and because it's not only our design storm information is already about 30 years old in terms of what people are currently using. So it's a big change from the baseline and whatnot.
I'll get you back to the slide you were on. Sorry.
And the next slide, please. And so essentially the challenge for a lot of local governments is we have this plumbing in our urban landscape, everything from storm drains, storm drain pipes, stormwater ponds, detention ponds, swales, drainage channels, and they're all designed to have capacity to handle certain big storms and to be non-erosive for usually smaller storms. So like a 2-year storm is often the threshold for being non-erosive, like in a grass channel. and yet the channel itself it has a capacity to move the 10-year storm. But if it's bigger than that, it can't handle it. And so it backs up. So one of the sort of predictions that we see for most communities is the most sensitive part of their watersheds. They're actually in their headwaters before you get into the large storm drain systems, so that we'll see damage uh, in the channels and ditches leading to the larger storm drains, because our plumbing just can't handle the higher flows that we have. Um, so if we go to the next slide, and I must confess, this is one of the oldest slides in my collection. It's from 1987. But it shows, if you just look at it normally, the pre-development floodplain and then the effect after we develop upstream of increasing the vertical limit of the floodplain, which gets more properties and infrastructure at risk. As a society, we like to think that there's these floodplain boundaries are pretty fixed, and generally our assumption is that we establish the width and height of the floodplain by the 100-year storm event. But in reality, the floodplain boundaries are really dynamic in both space and time. And if you have a 500-year flood, it's going to go out of what the boundaries that are established. We have a program which I'll describe in a bit about FEMA floodplains, which is a very important fixed boundary, again, established by the 100-year storm in many cases. And that boundary is used to, if you're inside the boundary, you have higher insurance. If you're outside the boundary, you don't. And so there's this disconnect between the hydrologic boundary in space and time and the insurance boundary set by FEMA. And in the next slide, the question, if you get a 15% increase in rainfall for the 100-year storm, does that mean will my floods get worse by the same amount? So there's really two schools of thought. One school of thought says it might not be as bad as that, because we have a lot of inadvertent detention in terms of cracks and holes. We have undersized pipes and culverts that also provide inadvertent detention. We have a lot of detention ponds built over the last 3 or 4 decades. Many of them were over-designed and have a lot of freeboard, sometimes as much as 3 feet or so. Our streams, our urban streams in particular, have enlarged and in size in response to past bankful flooding, and so they may have a little bit more capacity. So that's like if you're an optimist. If you're a pessimist like I am, you say, well, our watersheds are getting harder over time. We have more impervious cover in the contributing drainage area. We're adding more impervious cover to each lot over time. We're having infill development, which is a great idea, but also increases impervious cover in the watershed, and our soils become more compacted over time. And the second reason for concern is those boundaries that we are using for FEMA insurance purposes are really out of date. They're based on watershed conditions that occurred in many cases 30 or 40 years ago, not only in terms of the rainfall and the design storms, but in terms of the land use information, because the process to update floodplain insurance maps is a federal one, and it's very lengthy. And then lastly, we have an aging patchwork of conveyance, detention, and flood control, and it's a real question as to whether um, it operates effectively as a system because it's been constructed in separate pieces over many, many decades. The next slide is just a comparison between the floodplain boundaries as established under the FEMA program versus local floodplain regs. And the FEMA floodplains are mapped locally. They provide those insurance boundaries. A lot of people don't understand that it excludes headwaters, that typically the top square mile of every watershed is not in any floodplain. They're defined by regression equations in many cases. They actually, to this point, historically, don't use intensity, duration, frequency curves. The FEMA program is very inflexible, so you must follow the rules. And as I mentioned before, the maps have a hard time keeping up with watershed development. Sorry about that, we've got a hot rodder out today. So that's the FEMA side of the equation. Whereas if you're, most communities also have local floodplain regulations, which are usually triggered by some kind of land development activity or zoning change. And their purpose is essentially to prevent flooding problems, create buffers, and essentially prevent future small drainage complaints. They do include the headwaters usually. That is, every development proposal has to analyze the whether it's in the floodplain. They do use intensity, duration, frequency curves. They sometimes piggyback on the FEMA maps and add some additional height for the floodplain. And the local floodplain regulations also help determine what on-site stormwater detention requirements are needed for downstream flood control. So it's kind of important just to understand that there's really two bins for managing floods. One is the FEMA bin and the other is the local floodplain regulations. We really can't change FEMA easily, but communities can change those regulations pretty well. So the next slide really, there's three realities that we have in our older communities, especially. The first is that our urban floodplain boundaries, whether they're the insurance boundaries or the local government boundaries, they're going to expand in the future. First, because of extreme rainfall, but also the effect of extreme rainfall is exacerbated by the fact we're making our watersheds harder over time and adding more impervious cover. We have a decrepit, failing stormwater plumbing. It's been kind of built as a kind of aging patchwork over time. In many cases, some of the pipes and channels and such are over a century old. And so we don't have a real robust. And then the third challenge is, if those floodplains are expanding, our flood boundaries are fixed. And so that creates some real issues in drawing the new lines, and the impacts of those can be pretty significant. So it's kind of like the situation is a lawyer's dream and a municipal nightmare right now about the change in floodplains over time. The next slide just kind of illustrates some of the concepts. It's just an aerial photo of about a 4 square mile watershed. Uh, it doesn't really matter where it is, but you can see in blue is the stream network, relatively intact, but the headwater areas are not in the FEMA floodplain. So the FEMA floodplain, if you have really good eyes, you can see the yellow dot with the R6 right in the center there. So in this case, the FEMA floodplain starts at R6 and goes downstream to the exit in the far right-hand side. So that's where the FEMA boundary is, but all the other headwater segments are subject to flooding as well, but they're not in the boundaries, in the insurance boundaries. So that's something that I think is important for a lot of communities to understand, that they can't be completely reliant on the FEMA maps for protecting their communities. In the next slide, is the some of the other issues, the floodplain insurance boundaries that we do have create a lot of real estate winners and losers. And the main reason for that is the floodplain insurance premiums have been skyrocketing over the last few years and are expected to continue to rise for the next several decades. So they, in many, particularly tidewater areas, they're almost becoming exorbitant. The fourth bullet is also a concern. We have a lot of stormwater ponds that were built in the past, but they're all owned by zombie HOAs, homeowner associations, and they lack the chops and the dollars to know what to do to maintain those ponds, prevent them from failing. And in our region, about 70% of the stormwater BMPs are privately maintained, but about 30% are now publicly owned and maintained. And when those communities are finding, when these older ponds, they can have $1 million price tag just to make over and repair one failing pond at a time. So it's a very big future maintenance liability, whether it's in the private sector or the public sector. So those are some of the concerns there. In the next slide, the question is, what can we do as a community to quickly find out what's our most vulnerable assets? And so we've been developing some guidance. We hope to continue doing so, but a quick planning checkup to identify our most vulnerable neighborhoods, our most vulnerable municipal infrastructure, our municipal facilities, which of our ponds are at most risk, and what habitats and open space as a community are also. And again, if you remember looking back at that slide of the watershed a few back, 40% of flood damage in the US of A occurs outside of the FEMA boundaries. So just because you're outside of that boundary doesn't mean that you're not prone to flood damage. And again, it's usually in those headwater areas in the top square mile or so. Let's go through these one by one. In the next slide, how do we identify which neighborhoods are most vulnerable? And here I think we have a lot of tools with our local GIS systems and our various hydrologic and hydraulic models to
Hey, Tom,
predict.
yeah, you have a question I think that popped in from the previous slide maybe is,
Sure.
are there any studies of evaporation change due to climate change?
Uh, that's a great question, and I believe evaporation and evapotranspiration are expected to increase in the future. I don't have any specific projections for the Bay or for the Northeast, uh, but in general, in terms of some of the impacts that we might expect to see, would be for things like green roofs and bioretention areas, particularly the ones that have the, there'll be more brownouts, if you will, with the vegetation and the green roofs because of the higher temperatures and greater evapotranspiration rates. So it'll be hard to keep enough moisture in the systems to maintain the plant growth. Um, so moving along, we're still working with a bunch of experts on how to do the modeling and the mapping analysis. But some of the key factors that a community probably has data is how close the neighborhoods are to water features and streams. How old is the development? Generally, the older development is more susceptible. Some watersheds with more upstream impervious cover. We can even troll our files to look at past drainage complaints where we've seen things in the past and whatnot. So we hope to make a more comprehensive list and kind of rank out which uh, factors would be the best used for screening purposes. But the other thing that's really emerged in the last couple of years is many of the most flood-prone neighborhoods in our communities are with people of color and a little bit lower down on the socioeconomic ladder because the land near floodplains is the least worst land. And so it's less valuable just because it has the flooding problems. And so I think it's wise to overlay some of the demographic and socioeconomic characteristics when the risk analysis is done. Because I think our profession has really fallen down when it comes to dealing with diversity and recognizing people of color. And so how then, when we do the screening, how do we prioritize equity and diversity? Um, Again, we hope to have some more guidance on that. And if we do find neighborhoods that are at risk and they're outside of the FEMA boundaries, what do we tell the residents about their flood risk, how they can flood proof, or the opportunities to get private floodplain insurance? Um, so that's um, the first kind of screening thing. And we've only about 15% of the way through putting it together, but I think it's a kind of a useful tool to kind of look at the smaller watersheds, again, um, 500 acres or less, and look at each neighborhood within a small watershed from that lens. In the next slide, we have to look at our infrastructure, and usually most communities have a pretty good sense of where their infrastructure is. Um, the first concern is because of gravity, most of our water and sewer lines run along the stream corridor and are probably the most vulnerable to flooding. So too are local roads, bridges, and culverts. And when either the of those are damaged, it costs a huge amount of money to repair and a lot of time. Um, the other kind of hidden risk that we have as a community is Many of our older stormwater ponds were built um, above roadway embankments um, as a cost saving things. And so if they were to be blocked or failed, uh, the whole road is at risk. And so anyway, the idea is given the GIS information we have, how do we do an overlay to identify which specific parts of our municipal infrastructure and which specific locations are most at risk so that we can kind of prioritize which ones to upgrade and fix or retrofit to prevent future damage. Next slide, please. And this is an example of the problem I just mentioned. It's probably wouldn't be permitted today because it's kind of an on-stream stormwater facility. But you can see on the left-hand side is the embankment leading up to the road. And then you can see the culvert going underneath the road and the stormwater pond above it. And should it fail, the entire roadway would fail. And that would be, again, a multi-million-dollar price tag. So we just want to find what parts of the system are most at risk and try to prioritize those retrofits. Next, please. The same holds true for our municipal facilities. And the idea is if we know where they are, which ones are at greatest risk, and having an inventory of our facilities subject to flooding. Probably the top three are public works yards, which for some reason, I would say 90% of all public works yards I've ever seen have been located in the floodplain. I'm not sure exactly why that is, but it's kind of Schueler's universal law of public works locations. Wastewater treatment plants are also located uh, often in flood-prone areas, as well as the pumping stations to move sewage around. So the idea is to do an inventory to find out which, again, the first broad overlay to see what specific facilities are most at risk. And then once they're identified, to go out and do more site-based investigation about whether they can be flood-proofed or otherwise managed to minimize their risk of failure or flooding. Next slide, please. The next category is the MVP or the most vulnerable ponds. Most communities have a split between publicly owned ponds and privately owned ponds. They usually have a bunch of oddballs too, like older farm ponds or PL 566 ponds and reservoirs. In our region, most of them are near the end of their design life. They're 30 to 50 years old. They use construction materials that are no longer accepted, and their maintenance history has been pretty spotty. So some of the key risk areas, we have a pretty good sense about these. Most states have dam safety hazard regulations. And typically in the Bay region, they get triggered by any pond that has a drainage area of more than a square mile or an embankment height of 20 feet. And of course, that is the risk if it should fail, it would create a downstream flash flood that is catastrophic. We also kind of know that the design quality reflects the design era in which they were constructed. So if we know the age of the facilities, that's a good screening factor. The contributing drainage area, and not only that, but how much the contributing drainage area has changed since it was built. Many of our larger ponds didn't really anticipate having an increase of 15 or 30% of impervious cover in their watershed. And then lastly, is there any paperwork trail on their maintenance history to give us any confidence that they've been correctly maintained. And the next slide just shows what some of the issues are. The upper right-hand side is the barrel running through an embankment. And back in the 70s and 80s, corrugated metal pipe was all the rage. You can see that it's completely rusted out on the bottom, and it's an embankment failure waiting to happen. You can see in the lower left-hand side the groundhog holes, and those, along with muskrats, can completely mess up the integrity of an embankment. And then you can see on the lower right-hand side of, again, a corrugated metal riser, but it's also been clogged, and the embankment is beginning to fail. So again, the idea is to do an overlay of which ponds are theoretically at greatest risk, and then follow it up with field surveys to actually check out each individual one at risk, and then prioritize which ones to fix. And it's pretty expensive, so most communities can probably only take on one or two of these a year, depending on their resources. So it's important to make good choices. I actually serve on a county climate resilience authority. They just commissioned a study to analyze their ponds and make these decisions. They're using the COVID rescue money, about $10 million to finance the whole effort. So kind of a creative way to solve that problem. Next slide.
We have a few questions, actually. So first, are there future expansions to accommodate more runoff from climate change or development considered in the initial design? And Thomas, if you want to expand, if you mean on the detention basins themselves, or but so he goes on in his question in the chat for retention and detention areas. Oh, is that a train, Tom? You said I know. Anyway, so retention or detention areas, is there an ability to add more surface area to capture more based off of the initial design?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it varies from site to site. But in most cases, the older ponds were literally shoehorned into the landscape, to reduce costs. And so there's not a lot, it's not easy to greatly expand their plumbing. On the upper left-hand side, you can see the kind of the cross-section of a stormwater pond. And so a good engineer can figure out how to make them more, to mess around with the plumbing, to handle bigger storms better, as long as they haven't been too much sediment deposition. That's probably the other key thing about these pond makeovers, is that you can regain some of the storage by removing the sediments that have accumulated in the first 30 or 40 years.
Yeah, we have a lot of detention and retention basin modifications and retrofits that are kind of like the hot topic right now over here, where people are modifying the risers. Westmoreland County's been doing this a bunch. I think it's happening in Allegheny County, but I know it for sure was something their conservation district was doing a couple of demonstration projects on, to show how even really simple solutions would be allowed to increase the amount of wet detention that was available within a BMP, so that it could handle larger storms. But you're right, Tom, they're often sometimes they're viewed as the grassy area between the suburban house structures, so it can get a little tricky having those discussions. But we actually have another question for you too. So in the Chesapeake area, with the additional rainfall that you're experiencing in intensity and volume for your rainfall totals, have you had an issue with springs? If so, how are you dealing with springs that often damage our infrastructure, cause sinkholes, and affects our roads? As you know, we have a issue where sinkholes eat buses here. So I don't know if your sinkholes eat buses, but ours do. So how are the springs in the Chesapeake?
Yeah, my sinkholes are bigger than your sinkholes. No, that's going back to the earlier question. I think there are opportunities to retrofit older detention ponds to improve their water quality performance. And we do that a lot in the Chesapeake Bay, but their water quantity performance, that's a much harder thing to do because as you can kind of see, like from the wedding cake on the pond cross section, much of the storage of the pond is devoted to the extreme storms, and it's only detained for 5, 10, 20 minutes, but it's hard to add to that easily. And I'm sorry, I just lost my train of thought as to the original question. That was
No, the second question is about springs and sinkholes.
Springs.
And how
Yeah.
to, yes.
Yeah, we have. I'm not sure whether it's more an issue with extreme rainfall as it is from the decay of our infrastructure, where we inadvertently create springs and seeps because of our aging stormwater infrastructure. And it's a problem. It's a little bit harder to easily predict, so that's why we don't have an analysis for it. But I do think it's an interesting question, and it goes to that whole category of as communities age, they just have so many more small drainage complaints and things like sinkholes and whatnot. And it becomes more pronounced if you're in a karst region as well, which I'm not sure where you guys are or not, but a good part of our watershed is.
That's the end of the questions in the chat. If you want me to go to I think you were right about to go to the next slide, so I'll get there.
Thanks. We've talked a lot about hard stuff and the risk to infrastructure, but what are our most vulnerable habitats? And this area, we are still trying to develop some of the science, but we do know that we have considerable habitats in public ownership, many of them are in greenways, trails, and parks that the community uses. And the question is, which of them are at greatest risk or vulnerability to future change, whether it's in terms of urban stream quality, in terms of either the habitat of the stream bed or the floodplain disconnection or riparian degradation, and the disturbance that produces invasive plants. So the idea is, we have better data now on what habitats we have. The question is, how can we overlay changes in the hydrology, not only of flooding, but urban groundwater, which kind of gets to the last point the last question that someone raised. And so I think on this one, if you go to the next slide, it's one of my favorite slides. It just shows a stream corridor, and if you have really good eyes, the light blue is the floodplain. The hatched areas are the hydric soils that appear on uh, NRCS soil survey, the National Wetland Inventory wetlands are in the darker blue. You can see this stream is in whatnot. So I guess the point is they're all co-located together in many cases, that we don't have huge amounts of habitat areas left in our urban watersheds, but the ones we do are all focused in the stream corridor. And so the question is, which of those specific parcels is likely to be influenced in the future more by more runoff or less groundwater. And we often have situations in our urban floodplains now that they're so incised that although they're floodplains, they're disconnected from the groundwater table, and the tree species no longer have wet feet at all. So we have a kind of a dryland forest growing up in our floodplains. So there's still a lot of questions about how to do the analysis, but I just kind of throw it out as kind of a challenge about how we can make that work. So if we go to the next slide, and I know we have to go back and look at our local stormwater criteria and take more of a life cycle approach to our design criteria to, in most cases, and I know in Pennsylvania, your stormwater manual is pretty ancient now. It's over a decade old. Most of ours are about 10 years old as well. So we need to kind of, for our future stormwater practices, really strengthen them, look at the realization that they will be subject to warmer conditions, they'll be subject to higher entrance velocities, and they'll need to have plumbing that can withstand an increase in larger storm events. And so we hope in the next year or two to come up with some comprehensive guidance for local government to change their design specs to become more resilient. And in that area, we'll be hopefully working closely with a lot of engineers and landscape architects to kind of come up with a better set of rules for how to do them. Why don't we skip the next slide, because I know I've gone a little bit long. And,
you don't have to worry, Tom. We actually book this usually for an hour and a half because I knew that there'd be some good discussion. So you're doing great. We're right on time. No worries.
Yeah, okay. So some of the kind of specific targets in terms of if we're going to go back and change our design criteria is a better look at what I call the BMP plumbing. Most of our stormwater practices, particularly our LID practices, use curb cuts and other forms to direct runoff into them. And many of them also rely on under drains. And we just have to make sure that that plumbing can last a decade or more without failing and requiring a maintenance fix. And that's a pretty minimum expectation in my view. But right now, when you go out and look at 200 bioretention areas, easily a quarter of them are no longer functioning because the flow can't get into them or bypasses them, or there's problems with the underdrain. And that's come out from quite a few surveys in our region. So figuring out how to, just as a personal note, like with bioretention, it always seems to be the problems occur at the inflow point in the curb cuts, whether it either creates erosion or it creates blockages. And we just need better standard entry designs that are maintainable and they last a long time. We also need a sustainable plant community that can improve practice function and create legitimate habitat. We've been recommending for several years now to shift from a mulch model for our bioretention to a perennial meadow that can be mowed a couple times a year, but attracts pollinators and such. And then we also have to have a design specs that produce a reasonably routine maintenance burden that can be handled by trained landscape contractors. It's too expensive to send engineers out to do fancy inspections. And but one example, in the Chesapeake Bay watershed, we have about, I think at last count, about 18 million people altogether. But we have 100,000 landscape contractors, and they're quite an untapped team. And so we have several programs in the watershed that train the landscape contractors on how to perform improve stormwater BMP maintenance. And they create a certification that can be specified in both HOA and municipal contracts so that they can get the job done. And so that, I think, is certainly one of our ideas that should be exported to other regions of the country.
Hey, Tom, based on what you were just saying, are you using workforce development programs for those maintenance needs? That comes from Thomas, who works for Land Force. And if you don't know anything about Land Force, they have a really cool model for that type of program. Do you have any similar programs in the Chesapeake Bay?
Yeah, there's a number of workforce development programs, and the targets, in terms of the age, there's some of just getting people job ready that focus on the high school age crowd. We're working ourselves with people earlier in their careers, the first 0 to 5 years. So yeah, I think workforce development is important, but it needs to be really tied into the maintenance market so that when people are trained up, they really do have a job. And also the notion that, no one, went up to their mama and said, I want to grow up and be a BMP maintainer when they were a little kid. So it's not likely that, this would be like a gateway into the environmental profession, but they may only be in there for a few years because of the job turnover. So there's some challenges on the workforce development, but it's certainly an area that we've seen a lot of improvement in the last couple of years.
What about Tom followed up with the additional aspect of community stewardship programs, which ties into a question even I was thinking about. Have you seen successful volunteer maintenance programs? Or because on the slide it does talk a lot about trained landscape contractors, and that's a high bar for us, at least in the Ohio River, right? So sometimes it's the churches and in the watershed where I worked, we had an adopt a rain guard program that it was because I think sometimes we're not building maintenance into our initial budget as well as into our initial kind of assumptions around the green infrastructure. So have you seen successful versions of volunteer programs, or do you really highly recommend those individuals always be paid and be trained?
I think if we really want to expect things to be done, people should be paid. Volunteers are great. We've had adopt a pond programs. But essentially, the challenge is for most people that own a BMP, they really don't understand what the function of it is, what the maintenance practices are. They're fine when it comes to picking up trash and to doing, cosmetic, and there are a lot of like garden clubs that are really great about dealing with the vegetation. But getting back to trained landscape contractors, we now have to know in our crews, they have to have the ability to identify invasive plants from good plants and be able to um, take them accordingly. Um, that's one of the advantages, by the way, of that kind of perennial meadow approach. Is it really reduces, it keeps the invasive plants out, and it most municipalities and landscape contractors, they know how to mow. They may not like to weed, and a lot of us in springtime we love doing it, but making it a little bit more routine, so that like when you have a landscape management contract for your subdivision, or you have a municipal uh, landscape contract, you can specify. And before I forget it, the organization is called the Chesapeake Bay Landscaping Professionals, CBLP, I think is what it's called. So I would follow up. They do a lot of training through the community college programs, and they have, I think, cycled hundreds of people through the training. So it's been pretty good.
Tom, one of the things that I apologize to interrupt with even my own question, but I listen and I really appreciate a beautiful meadow. I find that I understand them, but I worry it's because of my professional uh, intuition, right? That I'm able to understand what I'm looking at. A lot of times those meadows look unkept to the general public, or as if we're not doing our jobs. The idea of mowing versus meadow, have you had a lot of, or because maybe you have more farmland or larger land area practices where this can be applied, have you seen those meadows be successful? Or do you get a lot of complaints from individuals who may not understand why they exist, uh, and think that they're supposed to be maintained lawns or mulch gardens?
Yeah, that's a great question, and it is true that most residents have two expectations. They either want to see nice grass turf or a forest, and any intervening state is a little bit questionable. But the reason why the mulch meadow I think makes sense is that while they can get bushy, they can be, maybe 3 or 4 feet tall at their maximum. Uh, in the wintertime or the late fall, you come through and um, mow it down so it looks fine during the non-growing season. Although I must confess, my wife and I always argue about when I mow my conservation landscaping areas down, because she's thinking about that last sparrow in the middle of March, looking for the last seed. So, uh, but basically, the we really can't sustain the current approach, which is to have this mulch subsidy every 2 years, and the expectation, or try to maintain certain kind of plants with all the invasives that we have. So I think it's as long as it's done properly and mowed 2 or 3 times a year, it's a good approach. I have several on my property, and I usually get compliments. Although I do find a lot of liquor bottles that people throw in them over time. So, anyway, moving right along. First of all, just in the photo, it's actually kind of a historic photo. It's in Prince George's County. For many people that use bioretention, they were the first ones to come up with a design spec. So I believe this is in their county administration building. It's the third bioretention area ever built in America. But you can see that the curb cut inlet blew out, and the entire bioretention area it has failed. I think they've since repaired it, but at a cost of about $10,000. So um, we it's just kind of an illustration of the first bullet, which is we have to look at how the rainfall will change our plumbing assumptions. How can we maintain runoff capture throughout the year, but have enough bypass or overflow when the storms become more extreme? And how do we measure loss of hydrologic function easily and the long-term risk that the BMP fails? The second bullet looks at some of our other green assets. We have a lot of stream and shoreline management, as well as floodplain restoration. And all of those municipal assets are online. And so they're kind of exposed directly to the effects of flooding. So as one example, in the stream restoration arena, we had to come up with new inspection and verification procedures to assess every 5 years how they're functioning, and the ability to flunk a project that no longer is. So I guess we've talked a lot about the rainfall, but the temperature issues we alluded to, and the notion that green roofs, which are a modestly common practice in our highly urban areas, but particularly our bioretention areas, will get fried and browned out. We also have, and this you should be happy, a problem that you're happy not to have, is we have a lot of what we call blue sky flooding in our tidewater areas that are produced by what they call king tides. And so it's a fine day otherwise, but because of sea level rise, a lot of tidewater urban areas are exposed to that flooding. And what it does is it kind of spreads out over the streets and commercial areas, and the juice, if you will, it brings back when the tide goes out is transported to the bay. So it's kind of a tough problem to solve. So then, yeah. So I've talked far too much, and I apologize. But I think based on what you've heard, I'd love to hear a discussion from you all. You can unmute and whatnot about what kind of ideas make sense to export, what you're doing to cope with climate change. Of all the things that I mentioned, which ones you think your managers should be most aware of? And how do you go about as a region to kind of get the consensus on what is a community response to the climate change? Because it's funny, most communities have climate action plans of some kind or another, but they deal with emissions and not as much impacts. And here, we're beginning to connect the dots between the extreme rainfall and the warming and how that will change our neighborhoods and infrastructure and habitats. So,
Tom, we do have one question that actually popped in the chat a little bit ago to even kick this off, maybe. Does the Chesapeake Bay have any, is it carrot or stick that you're seeing over in the Chesapeake Bay? Where are there price benefit advantages for per gallon street and basement flooding reduction? Have you seen those be monitorized? And, how are people working to address those kind of flooding actions?
yeah, it's a great question. We're in terms of flood response, it's primarily a carrot approach rather than a stick approach. The TMDL that we operate under doesn't deal with the quantity of runoff. It just deals with sediment. nitrogen and phosphorus. Um, and so the probably biggest carrot is the community floodplain management credit, which is a way for people to get lower premiums in communities, within the FEMA floodplain, if the community has adopted various programs and policies to minimize upstream flood damage. So that's probably the bigger one. But to be honest, this is an issue that for the first 34 years of my career, we didn't focus on. So we woke up a couple years ago, just like with the pandemic, and go, oh my goodness, we have a bunch of things that we need to figure out how to do. And we have, while we were fixated with water quality for so many years, we kind of got out of shape when it came to stormwater quantity. So we're playing a big catch-up game right now, and I suspect many of you are as well.
I don't see any questions in the chat, but if you want to come off mute while anyone's typing a question and or thinking of coming off mute, I want to ask, do you have all of these assets mapped? Because listening to you discuss the idea of having a MVP for ponds and where most vulnerable habitats and where you need to, and doing site tours of detention basins across the region, one of the things that I thought was that the fragmentation of, I'm not quite sure right now if someone were to say, where are all the detention basins, privately owned or not, where do they even exist? So was there a large mapping effort done in the Chesapeake Bay so that you have almost a assets management manager of where this is all located, and then you can start doing heat maps of how they're failing and or not, or what condition they're in, or how to even define whether or not they're in a neighborhood who has environmental justice and equity and concerns around it. Tell me more about, is that something that Chesapeake Bay has done?
Well, the Chesapeake Bay, for the entire watershed, they have incredibly great land use data to the 1 meter resolution, which is available to any community that wants to. But usually it's the phase 1 communities that have the robust GIS systems where they do the municipal asset management. The smaller phase 2s, probably have some land use and maybe sewer and water and information, but there's probably some gaps there. So in some communities, before they can really figure out what's most vulnerable, they have to figure out what needs to be mapped.
Well, we are closer to the end of the meeting, but I do hope that some of you might have some questions to ask or want to just discuss anything with Tom. I know that the tricky thing is that the pessimism is real, but there's a lot of changes that are going to be happening, and just even thinking about the idea of a 71% increase in rainfall in our area, and how we're going to be actively working through, that 10 to 20% change in a design storm, definitely probably gives us all pause, right? Because some of us, I imagine yeah. So Stacy, I agree. It scares me. It scares me a lot. And I think there's a lot of opportunity for us to do our best here to figure out what to do next. But I don't hear anyone coming off mute unless I don't hear anybody. So I know how Zoom works and Teams. It's often a quiet environment. So I apologize, Tom, that we're not all super talkative. But so I got the question in the chat that will there be a copy of the presentation slides? Tom, are these up for being shared? Is that okay?
Sure.
Awesome. Thank you. And wait, I do see a hand up. So let me switch over to a different view to see whose hand it is. Yes. Ryan Quinn, please feel free to come off mute and ask your question.
Okay. Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Tom, for putting all this valuable information in front of us. What really stands out to me is the maintenance aspect of these, and just at the scale the Chesapeake Bay has implemented this, and the scale of the need for stormwater infrastructure. I was wondering, you mentioned that your network is looking at trying to assess it, sort of like how to improve the efficiency or the ability to kind of deal with larger extreme events. And I was just wondering to what extent maybe the work that you're thinking is needed would kind of be assessing sort of like what are the maintenance drivers for the systems that are already built. Would you be considering sort of opportunities or sort of gathering lessons learned from what's been built and sort of how the last decade has maybe affected those facilities?
Yeah, that's a great question, and even if we didn't have any increases in rainfall, we would still have to deal with the declining quality of our stormwater infrastructure because of age and lack of maintenance. So the two can't really be separated out. And in our region, the MS4 permits require communities to inspect their legacy stormwater BMPs anywhere between once every 3 years or every 5 years, depending on the state. So that has really pushed us to come up with better techniques for rapid inspection, more creative ways to retrofit them to restore their capacity, and trying to create a private sector maintenance market that works. So all those challenges are right in front of us, and we're working on them as best we can.
Thanks so much, Tom. And I don't see any other hands raised or mics off mute. So I'm going to just wrap up and say thank you so much for your presentation today and for partnering with Jen to discuss the Chesapeake and how communities are reviewing their assets to decide what's working and how can we together become more resilient as a region. And so I learned a lot and I really enjoyed it. And I know on behalf of all of the GIN members, we're just really grateful for you presenting today. And for those of you still on the line, just as a sneak peek for what's coming up, I highly recommend that you look out for GIN emails coming up. In May, we're doing a field trip to the University of Pittsburgh to see green roofs and water recycling programs and some of their innovative technologies that they've installed on some of the alleys and streets and buildings throughout the campus. So please join us in May on the 24th. Those emails will be coming soon. That will be a registration event, but it will be a field trip in person, walking, talking, seeing each other. It'll be wonderful. And I hope you'll consider joining us. But with that in mind, I wish you a good wet weather season here in the spring. I hope it does not bring us a 5-inch storm in 2 hours, as Tom kicked off the presentation with, or even worse, inch rain in such a short period of time. Let's hope for thoughtful rainstorms and thoughtful engineers and governments and municipalities as we move forward. So thank you all, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Goodbye.